I have owned my Honda Transalp for 16 months now and I still enjoy the bike. I think the Transalp is one of the best all-round bikes, especially for riders on a budget. I plan to do a complete owner's review of the bike soon, but for now I just want to focus on 10 things on the Transalp that are less than perfect or things that annoy me. Before we get started, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and I would also like to hear from you in the comment section if you own or have owned a Transalp yourself. Okay, let's get started. There are a few things on the Transalp that are a bit of a disappointment, and I can even let you hear what disappointment sounds like. It sounds like this. It should be clear by now that the Transalp's bash plate is made of plastic. Honda could have given it a full-fledged metal bash plate like on the Africa Twin of the same generation and even on the cheaper Dominator of the time, but they didn't. The fact that it is made of plastic with the structural rigidity of a Tupperware container also positions the Transalp in Honda's dual sport lineup of the time as the more road-focused option. Honda themselves are somewhat apologetic about it by not daring to call it a bash plate or a skid plate or an engine guard in the official parts catalog. They just call it a cowl, which it is basically. By the way, what bothers me is not the fact that it is made of plastic, but the fact that it is meant to look like aluminium, and I don't like materials that pretend to be something else. I hate fake carbon, I hate imitation leather, and I also hate plastic pretending to be metal. I think it just looks ridiculous. The second thing I hate on the Transalp is the windscreen. The wind buffeting it creates is the worst I've ever experienced, with the airflow hitting me right on the helmet. This means that even at very moderate speeds I'm constantly riding around in a terrible wind noise. I always have earplugs in to protect my hearing of course, but even then I occasionally feel the need to just stand up on the footpegs to put my head in clean air and enjoy the absolute silence. When I bought the Transalp, it had an aftermarket screen on it that was extremely tall, but that was even worse. In fact, I bought this aftermarket MRA screen with the same shape and dimensions as the original screen because I thought it would create much less turbulence. Unfortunately, that wasn't the case. Now I know wind noise is dependent on a lot of factors, such as your height, your body position, your helmet, etc. Nevertheless, I think that perhaps I'm not the only one with this problem, as I once saw a Transalp riding around with its screen completely removed. The third item on my list is the front brake. It only has one brake disc and caliper, and that's really not enough. Honda actually admitted as much by fitting a second disc to the front wheel starting from 1997. Unfortunately, mine is a 96 model and so my front brake has very little stopping power. By now I have even adapted my riding style to compensate for it, by starting to brake much sooner on the Transalp than I would on other motorcycles. And I always keep in mind that it's best to avoid situations where I would have to hit the brakes hard. The fuel filler cap is the next item on my list. It is the kind that completely detaches from the tank as opposed to a filler cap with a hinge. I always find it irritating to have to find a place to put the filler cap while I'm filling up. Usually there's room on the pump itself, but those surfaces are often dirty and you don't want the bottom of the cap touching the dirt, so you put it upside down, but the key is still in it, and so now the cap has become a rolling object. It has happened to me that the cap fell from the pump to the ground, where it then picks up even more dirt you don't want in your tank. There's also an arrow on the cap, which I have recently discovered needs to be pointing forward for venting the tank so the fuel flow isn't hindered. Now, if the arrow needs to be pointing forward, you have to put the cap on with the arrow pointing backward because you still have to give it a half turn to screw the cap on. Anyway, I think it's a bit of a hassle and I would have preferred a simple cap with a hinge. Number 5 on my list is the odometer. It works perfectly, but I'm annoyed by the fact that Honda deemed it necessary to provide only 5 digits for the kilometers, so that the odometer resets to 0 after hitting 100,000 kilometers. What bothers me is not the fact that without a service history you don't know if your odometer is showing the actual mileage. What actually bothers me is the seeming lack of ambition on the part of Honda. I find it strange that a brand that is known for its reliability puts a touring bike on the market that could travel the world 10 times over and then provides it with an odometer that rolls over at a measly 100,000 kilometers. Now, I know that many classic vehicles, including even cars and trucks, have 5-digit odometers, but it still bothers me. It makes a Transalp look like a disposable product rather than the tough, durable motorcycle that it is. The next item on my list is the lack of a 6th gear. It's not uncommon to have only 5 gears on motorcycles of this era, and for most of its uses the Transalp's 5 gears are more than sufficient. However, it's on the highways that a 6th gear would have been very useful. I always prefer to ride at the legal maximum speed, and in my country that's 120 km per hour or 75 miles per hour on freeways. You can see here that if I maintain that speed on the GPS, the engine revs are just over 6000 RPM. Now, the engine of the Transalp is quite economical, except when you keep it high in the revs. So for cruising at relatively high speeds, it would have been very nice to have a 6th gear as a sort of overdrive to keep the revs and the fuel consumption down. Talking about speed brings me to the 7th item on my list, and that's the speed wobble the Transalp exhibits when you push it to its top speed of just over 160 km per hour. Now, I don't ride that fast very often, but it has happened to me on the unrestricted highways in Germany that I wanted to keep up with another rider on a faster bike, and suddenly the front of the Transalp started to wobble dangerously. Luckily, the wobble disappears as soon as you roll back on the throttle. By the way, I wanted to recreate this effect for this video, but then I realized that trying to film something called a death wobble while riding at high speeds with just one hand on the handlebars is perhaps not the greatest idea. So instead I'm giving you some random footage of the Transalp's front wheel at a very moderate speed. The next item that is less than perfect on the Transalp is the amount of plastic bodywork. The bike has quite a few large plastic panels that are attached to the frame by only a few bolts and some plastic tabs. Often the rubber washers or grommets for those fasteners have hardened or have gone missing. When I bought my bike, for example, it had only 25,000 kilometers on the clock, but quite a few tabs had already broken off and a bolt had created a fracture line in one panel. I think that for a bike that has at least some off-road aspirations, the fairings are too large and too fragile. Dropping the bike will almost always cause a panel to need a little duct tape to stay in its place, like this one here. I think my generation of Transalp is the most beautiful, sitting somewhere between the very angular and very 80s design of the first generation and the weird but soulless design of the last generation. Of course, every owner will think his bike is the most beautiful, but I really like how Honda brought the OG Transalp from the 80s into the 90s by redesigning the fairing and giving the bike a more modern appearance. However, there's one design feature they carried over from the first gen, and that's this line in the bike's silhouette. One journalist referred to it as the Transalp's beer belly, and I agree that it sticks out and doesn't fit in with the new, sharper front end of the 90s Transalp. The last item on my list is the popular perception of the Transalp. At least where I live, the Transalp has a somewhat boring image. It is often perceived as a slow motorcycle for old men. What's strange then is that at the same time there are many channels on YouTube of adventurous people who travel around the world on a Transalp. They use it as their weapon of choice to cross rough terrain and inhospitable environments, and they rely on the ruggedness and the durability of the Transalp to bring them safely home. In other words, the extreme capabilities of the Transalp stand in stark contrast to its public perception as a dull and rather unimpressive bike, and I think that's a shame. So that concludes my list of 10 things I don't like about the Transalp. I've had to think hard to come up with this list, and I still think the Transalp is a great bike overall. I'll probably explain in another video why that is the case. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, and I'll see you in the next one.